Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present this paper. Es un placer realmente visitarlos nuevamente, aunque sea virtualmente, de Chile. Como todos ustedes, yo estoy en mi casa en Minneapolis, pero es algo muy bueno poder contactarse inclusive en ese tiempo. Okay, so I'm going to present today some work that we've been doing on COVID with an application of emerging markets. This is a joint work with Yen Bai and Gabriel Michalash. And of course, just so that my disclaimer, the views here are our views and do not represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So motivation for this paper, as many other papers that have been written in the last few months, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which is presenting huge challenges worldwide. Of course, it's a disease that it's deadly, it's highly contagious, and many countries around the world are imposing lockdowns, or have been imposing lockdowns. Now some of them are relaxing lockdowns to control the disease, save lives, and advanced economies. Actually, all countries are engaging in fiscal transfers, but this sort of the advanced economies are especially engaging in large fiscal transfers to protect and ensure citizens. For emerging markets, many of countries, Chile, Ecuador, many countries in Latin America, some in Asia too, Eastern Europe, the pandemic presents additional problems. One of them, and that's going to be the object of study here in this paper, is that many countries are starting already with large levels of government debt. They face sort of rising international borrowing rates. Some of them, Argentina, Ecuador, for example, they are already sort of in default. They have looming defaults. And sort of this is just a symptom of the fact that the emerging markets have limited fiscal space, which of course makes it very difficult for governments to handle and to manage this epidemic. Second issue with the pandemic is that potentially it is a large external shock with collapses in sort of export demand, tourism, remittances, capital flows. So sort of COVID-19 is sort of presenting these challenges in terms of generating a health crisis and an economic crisis across the world. But for emerging countries, in addition, it could potentially generate a debt crisis. So just some of the data you've seen, some of the data. This is as of a few weeks ago. So COVID-19 is growing in emerging economies. Sort of Brazil was in the news recently as sort of very, very high levels of number of fatalities. Chile is actually not in the plot. It's maybe similar to Mexico's patterns actually, with sort of cases going up to daily deaths going up to 400 or so a day. But other countries too, Ecuador, Peru, Turkey, Russia, they've had these sort of growing deaths, and this is just a representation of the health crisis that emerging economies are facing. There's large human costs in emerging economies, sort of around 100,000 as of a few weeks ago in total. These are just official deaths, and of course, sort of actual deaths, we've read about these, might exceed the official deaths. Sort of these some estimates for excess deaths, sort of for the United States, for example, at 60%, but for some of emerging countries, this is an orders of magnitude two times in Turkey, or some estimates in Ecuador were like 15 times. So sort of the official human cost of COVID-19 for emerging countries has been very large, but likely it's even larger. Many countries have experienced sort of also these rising in sovereign spreads. So you can see here, so from the beginning of the year, credit default swaps for government bonds in several emerging markets, and you see that the CDS spreads rose between 200 and 400 basis points for many countries. And it's also been accompanied with actual defaults. So Argentina, Ecuador, Lebanon, and actually several other countries have already started, a process of default, a process of restructuring the debt. So, this COVID-19 epidemic is accompanied with sort of the classic crisis in emerging markets, which feature these rising sovereign spreads and even actual defaults. So what we're going to do in these papers, we're going to think about studying these broader framework of COVID-19 that generates a health, economic, and debt crisis. And we're going to make two main points with this framework. The first point is that in our framework, we're going to construct an environment where the epidemic can generate the debt crisis with defaults and high spreads. And the second point we're going to make is that actually the debt crisis, the susceptibility of the debt crisis itself can make the health crisis worse because this gives this limited fiscal space that can make mitigation strategies more costly. So we're going to start with an environment. We're going to think about an environment that has like two modules. The first module is this sort of economic module where sort of consumption is one of the goods, is going to be determined by what is happening with production, economic output here, and also with the availability of international credit. We're going to think about an environment pre-epidemic that is very benign, where there's low default risk and sort of economic production is in normal levels. There's going to also be these health module here, and the health of the population is going to basically determine life expectancy and mortality risk here. And again, we're going to think about an environment for us, for this epidemic, that where prior to the epidemic, health was, baseline health was a good health, and there was no really real source of mortality risk. To this environment, we're going to shock the system with the unexpected epidemic with the COVID-19. And of course, the first thing that's going to generate is going to, put pressure on the health of the individuals. And this is doing, people are going to be, the cases are going to start, and that is going to generate, that is going to lower, increase mortality risk. Okay. So in response to this health crisis, what's going to happen is that the economy is going to respond by implementing mitigation strategies in the form of lockdowns that are aimed at reducing the severity of the health crisis. These mitigation strategies, of course, the point here is that they are going to affect the economic side of things, and in particular is going to lower production and is going to lower the prospects of future debt repayment. Both of these factors are, might interact between each other. So sort of higher sovereign risk is going to generate lower production. Lower production is also going to put more pressures into default risk. And these two processes here, production and debt, is going to basically put a lot of pressure and depressed consumption in this economy. So in response to these, of course, but the good thing about the mitigation strategies is that they're going to alleviate the debt crisis. So sort of this reduced consumption is going to put, again, pressure into sort of relaxing those mitigation measures. In particular, is going to lead to put pressures into lowering and lessening lockdowns, which in turn might sort of improve a bit the costs and in terms of consumption, but is going to make the health crisis worse. So this is going to basically lead to the second point here. So the first point is that the health crisis is going to generate the debt crisis. But the second point is that when you have these sort of inability to use international credit because of possibilities of that crisis, then that is going to put more pressure into sort of having less lockdowns, and in turn making sort of the health crisis worse. You see here that sort of debt is sort of can play a central role. International debt and international capital flows can actually play a central role in terms of the interactions between what is happening in the economic side of things and the health side of things. So what we're going to do next is actually we're going to study, these debt relief policies. Okay, we're going to evaluate counterfactuals where sort of an external entity, a financial entity, provides some debt relief to this economy. And the debt relief is going to lower default risk, is going to alleviate sort of the pressures in terms of consumption, which in turn is going to allow for the economy to deliver a more effective mitigation strategy that can alleviate itself the health crisis. So we find that this, in our model, this is going to be a sort of a third main point, which is that debt relief has been very, very beneficial. It has positive social values. And the reason is because it alleviates the debt crisis, the costs associated with the debt crisis, and also it can save lives. So sort of the rest of the talk is going to go on the details of this framework. But before that, let me give you some quantitative findings. So this is going to be a quantitative framework that can actually help us think through quantitative exercises. So we find that in our baseline economy, okay, the epidemic can generate, and I'll tell you more details on, how we parameterize that baseline economy, but it basically can lead to a long debt crisis. So the idea here is that the health crisis, which is long, I mean, people have already been at home for months, it seems very long, but in the context of this framework is going to be over in a year or so, okay? But the debt crisis is going to last for much longer than the health crisis, and it's going to be sort of lasting about like 3.5 years whereas the epidemic lasts about a year and a half or less actually. So this leads to debt crisis that is long, that has low defaults, have rising spreads. We're going to think about also optimal mitigation strategies, optimal lockdowns, and we're going to find that they're going to last for about 8 months in the context of our model. But it's different intensity. So it's going to be like 2 months of fairly high intensity and then sort of like lessening intensity over time. We're going to find that these optimal lockdown mitigation strategies are going to be quite effective in reducing the fatalities of this epidemic. It's going to reduce the fatalities of the epidemic by about 0.5% of the population. And we find that the epidemic is going to be very costly. I mean, this is obvious, but just in terms of numbers, this is about 1.8% in consumption equivalence. So this is like, orders of magnitude higher than the standard measures of, say, business cycles. We're going to find that whether, how much debt economies have at the outbreak of the epidemic is going to matter for how the epidemic plays out. And we're going to find that economies that start the epidemic with less debt are going to be able to use borrowing to support consumption. So they're going to fare better because they have this sort of larger fiscal space. And then you're going to use that to support consumption, avoid the costs from the default, from the debt crisis. And in addition, it's going to allow the economy to implement slightly more severe mitigation strategies that can save more lives. In terms of debt relief, we find that a program that is, say, as a baseline program is going to be of 10% of output of sort of fresh loans for the emerging economy that are basically, it's a program that is structured so that this financial entity actually breaks even, so nobody's losing money here from this program, but they actually has big benefits for the country of about like 9.4% in terms of present value consumption, goods. Actually 9.4% of output. So it's a very large gain. And the gains are coming because the country actually avoids the debt crisis, the defaults, and reduces fatalities. Okay, so quickly on the literature. So sort of our paper fits into this large and growing literature on macro and COVID-19 that has been developed in the last few months, more on the emphasis of emerging markets. So less work on these, but we think that this is very important because emerging markets are going to have sort of special features, and in particular, sort of a limited fiscal space is one important aspect. But there are some work here that have looked at the developed economies that were complementary, where they don't really have a debt crisis in their models. So we are gonna our work on the debt relief is also going to connect to the literature on debt buybacks, and here sort of we sort of find that. In the context of this epidemic, the types of benefits from debt relief are actually larger than sort of standard measures that have been stated before. Okay, so I can move to the model. I'm not sure if people want to ask a question at this point, or we should move on.
So if you have a question, please let us know. You can write it on in the Q&A section.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So I'll just keep going. You can feel free to actually, if you write your questions, I think Ernesto is going to, stop me at some point and ask me any questions that you guys might have. Okay, so let's move on to the model. Whoops, wait, let me just do this. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the model is going to be a small open economy model where there's a government and there are homogeneous consumers. This economy is sort of like what I was describing with the bubbles earlier, is going to be hit by this unexpected epidemic. Now, the epidemic is going to follow a standard epidemiological sort of SIR model, susceptible, infected, recovered, actually and dead model, okay? It's going to be a very plain vanilla epidemiological model of the form of, how many of these papers in macro have adopted. The government is going to borrow internationally and it can default on its debt, okay? And we should think of these as a sort of a centralized planner that is deciding for the debt of the country and is deciding on lockdowns as well, mitigation policies. Now, default and lockdowns are going to be sort of freely, very flexibly policies, and they're going to be varying in intensity and varying in duration. So you should think of sort of, maybe if you're familiar a little bit with the default literature, for example, that I've contributed on, that literature usually has a very binary view of default, like 0, 1. Here we're thinking in a very flexible, so you can default on different intensity and also default on different duration, different number of periods. And we're going to analyze in this model sort of the dynamics of the epidemic, during the epidemic, from population groups, so epidemiological groups, the mortalities, the fatalities, the number of susceptibles, the number of infected cases recovered. We're going to also analyze the dynamics of the economic side of things, consumption, lockdowns, output, and also the dynamics of the health, the debt crisis, so how that is evolving, default, and spreads. And then, after I showed you what happens on this baseline, I'm going to provide, I'm going to explain and show you results on the debt relief counterfactuals. So preferences here for this economy consist of consumption, and also there's going to be a disutility from mortality. So the preferences are, valuing consumption of life. C is the per capita consumption. FTD is the sort of the number of fatalities at every period, and for every fatality, sort of the cost is as controlled by this parameter chi, which is associated with this value of life. Output in this economy is going to be equal to, it's going to depend on the population, it's going to depend on a productivity, sort of economy-wide productivity, and it's also going to depend on the mitigation policies. So the type of policies we're thinking are these lockdowns, which have this L parameter here. And the idea here is that that is going to control the percentage of people that are going to, have to stay home and not be able to work. Okay, so lockdowns are going to affect output, and output is going to be reduced by the severity of lockdowns. And here, this is 1 because we're sort of normalizing the initial sort of labor input for each person to be equal to 1. Okay, now let's talk about what the government does. So the government is going to use these international debt operations, B and L, okay? And I'll explain what that is, to support consumption. So consumption is going to, either consumption here, N times C, is going to be equal to the output of the economy, but it can deviate from the output, as in standard sort of income fluctuations type models, by the amount of debt. So B is the total amount of debt that the government owes in a particular period, and L, this sort of curly L, is the new loans that the government actually can borrow every period. These new loans are going to be, they can issue these new loans at a price that is QT, and this price is going to compensate for any future default that the government has. For, at every point in time, the government can choose to default on the outstanding debt B with intensity dt. So actually what the government pays every period is the level of debt. So if the government doesn't default, then it pays the full debt here. Here I wrote this with short-term debt. Actually, the implementation later has long-term debt. Basically pays the coupon, whatever it needs to pay if it doesn't default. And if it defaults, then it's going to just pay, the 1 minus the default intensity times that level of debt. Now, default is good because the government doesn't pay some of the debt, but there has to be a default cost. Otherwise, there would never, the government could never borrow anything because they would always want to default. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to assume that default is going to sort of affect the productivity of this economy and is going to be reducing productivity, and the reduction in productivity is going to be proportional to the default intensity. So the more the government defaults, the lower productivity is. Now what happens?
Cristina, I have a question.
Yes,
very quick one. So these are 1-period bonds? I'm a little confused with the maturity. Okay. And so the government decides every period whether it pays in full or defaults on some fraction of the outstanding debt.
Yes.
But it doesn't commit to default for, I don't know, 5 periods in advance.
It does not.
Right?
No.
Okay. So it's a period by period decision.
Period by period decision. Yes. Thank you for the question. Here, I'm gonna write it and present it with short-term debt. In the quantitative application later, we actually do this with long-term debt, so we can discuss there if you have questions. But for here, like the results don't really matter that much if you do short or long. So I just wanted to make it a little bit simpler for the presentation. But let me say something that happens. So I'm gonna take on what what Sophia was asking. So suppose that the government defaults on a fraction of the debt, okay? Then what happens here is that a fraction of that default, so suppose they defaulted on D times B, okay? So if the government defaults on a particular amount of debt, then a fraction of that debt, a fraction kappa actually, accumulates as arrears, okay? So maybe some of you are familiar with the debt sort of series and the debt statistics, and there's always this variable there that is arrears. So the basically is stuff that the government had to pay, but it didn't pay. So this is what we're gonna have. And so some of the debt that the government defaults on really is not defaulting, it's just sort of like pushing it forward, okay? So what happens is that the total amount of the debt that the government owes tomorrow, okay, is going to be equal to the total to the new loan that it issued today. Okay, this is the L. That's the standard, short-term debt thing. But it's also going to add the arrears. Okay. So in a way, even with short-term debt, with this formulation of partial default and accumulation of defaulted debt through arrears, the economy sort of features a flavor of long-term debt. Okay, so the price of debt, as in this price of new borrowing, is going to, so the government is trading with the rest of the world that is risk neutral and has a sort of a world interest rate, little r here, but the price is going to compensate for any future defaults. Okay, so you should think of the price as reflecting these type of CDS spreads that I showed before. Now, as this type of model is a sort of a variant of a standard default model and has basically similar properties. So the government is going to be more likely to default on the debt if it has a lot of debt. Okay, so this is when default is most beneficial. Also, when it has very low output, because this is when sort of you want to support consumption. One way to support consumption is by defaulting. And also, default is going to be more likely if it's very expensive to roll over that debt. So if future debt repayment prospects are very poor, then this price is going to be very low, meaning spreads are going to be very high. And these are times where default is going to be more attractive. Okay, so let me see if I can do this. Oh no, wait, okay, so that's the default part. Let me give you some details on the epidemiological model. So there's the population, okay, the population of this economy. Think about the, N0, the initial population, and they're gonna start as all being susceptible. They've never had this disease, this epidemic, so they're all susceptible. If they get infected, okay, then they transit to this infected state. So they're like in this group population, in this epidemiological group US. If they become infected with the epidemic, they move on to this infected state, mu I. And then from the infected state, they either recover from the epidemic and they transit into this mu R state, or, they die from the epidemic. You should think of these as basically like 99, almost 99.05, 99.5% of the population recovered from the disease, but so this fatality rate is about 0.5%, from 0.5% to 1%. Now, a key building block in this is just the standard, this is the textbook version of these SIR models, is, a key important part is, so how new infections are created. So if you want to think about like the production of new infections, okay? And so the notation here is mu X is this newly infected. And, basically the way that we're going to do it is the standard way, which is that the probability that a susceptible individual is transits to the infected state depends on the fraction of infected individuals. So the more infected individuals there are in the economy, the more likely that a susceptible will become infected with a disease. and also some sort of underlying parameter, which is this pi x here, which is related to this sort of famous R naught parameter. Okay, so if the R naught is very high, then the disease is very contagious, and the probability that a susceptible gets infected is higher. Now, as susceptibles get infected from the disease, the fraction of susceptibles is going to, decrease over time. The fraction of infected are also going to, are going to depend, of course, on these new infections. But there are some infected individuals in the previous period that will remain infected in this period. So if you think about the type of model we have here, this is going to be a weekly model. We're going to think that sort of the individuals are going to be infected for about like 18 days. Okay, so there's going to be a fraction of individuals that are going to be infected multiple periods. So this is what this pi I parameter is representing here. Then if the individuals are infected, then they're going to transit to, recovered or dead. The death rate here is going to sort of the number of total. This is going to be the total fatalities from this epidemic. Of course, it's going to depend on how many fatalities were the previous period, and it's also going to depend on sort of the probability that an infected dies. And we're going to assume here that this probability, this pi d, is going to be respond to the total infected population. And you should think of these as, this is sort of following actually Alvarez Argentilipi formulation of these epidemiological model to sort of take into account that the healthcare sector has these capacity constraints, and so if there are a lot of infected people in the economy, then the death rate might be higher. Sort of an infected individual that does not die is going to transit into this recovered state, sort of, and that's going to just be back to normal, and they're not going to be able to be reinfected from COVID.
Cristina?
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions about that slide.
Yes.
Question one is more specifically about the slide. I think that the assumption here is that immunity lasts forever. We know that, there's strong signals.
Can you repeat what lasts forever?
Immunity.
Oh, yes.
So probably, if you want to postpone the question, that's okay. How much of the results or the persistence of the results are going to rely on that assumption? And something related to that is that the rate of people who are infected or people who die is still quite low, even in countries that are kind of very much affected. So I'm wondering whether in the calibration later, we will have the government with the chi in the objective function will be such that government will be willing to do a lot of things about the lockdown with still very few cases or very few expected deaths.
Those are great questions. So let me just say first on the immunity. Yes. So I guess we're just leaning on these more standard pandemic type models that have that, I guess like measles, I guess is a very well-behaved, if you will, epidemic, according to what I've read from the epidemiologists. But that the immunity after you get it, then you don't get it again. So and there's now, I understand, questions about whether that's true for COVID. I guess that this is maybe the good case scenario in that sense, that we, once you get COVID, you're not going to get it again. Things might look worse relative to what I'm going to show you if you have recurrent epidemic. I guess you have multiple. You can have multiple waves here. Okay, so that's not going to be the issue. You could have multiple waves depending on the lockdown policies, but there is going to be sort of immunity forever here. So if you would think that it's not, then you might need to, I don't think that the framework would be fairly easy actually to modify it to have a probability of being infected again. But the result, I think, profoundly will change because sort of it's relying on this endpoint where things, where the epidemic passed. Now, there's always, up to a point, I mean, many of these epidemics, I guess, is like last 2-3 years historically. So I'm not sure if we would be able to detect whether it's really like a second wave because different lockdown policy permitted a second wave versus just really like reinfections of people that didn't even know they were infected before. So I think that maybe for the relevant, I think it's very unlikely, and I should say that to you, that this would last for 10 years. At most, it's 2-3 years, and so this is within the time frame that we're analyzing for this model. But I think the details will change. On the second point, so we're going to have that, and we're actually still thinking about how to best parameterize the model. But the total mortality rate from this epidemic is going to be at the end, and I'm going to show you 0.5% of the population. That's still very high compared to estimates that we've seen actually I think it's not that high if you consider a particular city. Okay, in some cities you can get at that, but it's just very high for our country as a whole. But even though you might think that may be high or low, it's higher than what we observed, but this value of life is still going to be really large. So the type of quantification policies that the government is going to be willing to do to basically save some lives is going, despite the fact that mortality rates are not very high, is like the output is going to decline by about 15% on an annual basis the first year to basically save those lives. So the value is going to be large, as you predicted. Okay, so this is how it works. So the lockdowns are going to have a problem, and I told you it's going to be costly because I just said that the output is going to be depressed with lockdowns. But the good thing about it is that the lockdowns are going to prevent new infections, and the way we're going to do it is that the lockdown policy of size LT is going to reduce the population for contagion by a fraction theta LT. This is again following this specification of Alvarez-Argentini. Okay, so basically this newly infected is going to be reduced by this amount, okay, by basically the larger mitigation policies, the more severe, the more infections are clamped down. And once you change how new infections are created with mitigation policies, then that is going to change the dynamics of the epidemic. It's going to change, of course, first of all, it's going to change the contemporaneous. So instead of, you can clamp down infections really fast if you lock them really tight here. But there's one question, which is that just simply going to delay the infections later, or is it going to really change the outcome of the number of people that get infected eventually? And we're going to find that, with some mitigation policies, these lockdowns that are changing sort of contemporaneous infections are in fact going to alter the final outcome of this epidemic. Okay, so just to put these two things together, so we have sort of a centralized type of planner, if you will, the government for us, that is going to have some state variables here. So this is going to be the epidemiological groups susceptible, infected, and dead. Actually, the recovered is just going to be the residual given the initial population size. And also they have the debt. And this government is going to choose, how much to borrow, default or not, and lockdowns to maximize sort of value of its value, where they value consumption and they value life. Subject to the fact that they understand that future population epidemiological groups, mu t+1 here, okay, are going to depend on what the state of the groups is today, so mu t, but also is going to depend on what the mitigation policy is chosen. The government understands that sort of the number of infections are going to affect how many fatalities the economy suffers. And the government so takes as given this resource constraint that says that consumption is going to be equal to output, net of the debt the government pays, reduced by the default, and also depending on these new loans, which are going to depend on sort of new loans and how much the government is going to owe tomorrow, but also is going to depend on sort of the arrears. And one important point here is that the price at which the government can borrow is going to reflect these default probabilities, okay? And because of that, it's going to depend on the level of debt, but also it's going to depend on the population, how the epidemic evolves. So the points that we're going to make here is, and maybe I can go over, so this is going back to the bubbles that I had in the beginning, which is that sort of when there's an epidemic, what's going to happen is that is going to lead to a reduction in output because of mitigation, and that is going to lead to a low future debt repayment prospects, which is going to reduce Q, is going to reduce the price, and that is going to put pressure for the government to default. And the second point is that, you know, when you have this debt crisis and when the price is very low, then consumption cannot be really, you know, smooth, and sort of lockdowns become extremely costly because, you know, not only reduce your production in present discounted value, but actually contemporaneously, you know, you're forced to reduce consumption together with output, and that is going to make the lockdown policies more costly, which is going to put pressure against locking down. And just this is going to just is the dynamic program in the paper. It's so this is the program. It's a little bit hard to solve, but it's not that hard to solve because we were thinking about this as a perfect foresight type model, where sort of there's just one path. And there is going to be default because this partial default allows for you know, some defaults that happen even absent any shocks. But sort of we can think of these as, but of course the policies. So this is a perfect foresight type path, but it's going to depend on all these state variables. So in the paper we have some details on how we handle that. Okay, so that is the model. Let me now move on to the parameterization of the model. So we have a set of parameters. Maybe I can stop if there are any questions. Okay. Okay, so the parameters. So there are some parameters in the model that are taken from estimates of this Diamond Princess, this ship that had the outbreak very early on in the pandemic, and the type of the fatality rate is going to be sort of I'm going to take the form from Alvarez Gentilipi and some of the estimates from there. It's going to be linearly increasing in the number of fatalities. So the way to think about this is that the death rate, as I said, is going to range from 0.5%, which is this given by this pi naught d, and you know, could range up to 1.2% at certain point in time when infections are at its peak. Okay, in equilibrium is going to be lower because part of the lockdowns are going to prevent infections from peaking. Okay, but that's basically the range of death rates. The R naught that we're thinking is sort of in the middle of the range, coming from these Diamond Princess, so 2.28. You know, the sort of the magic number is 1 here. So if the R naught goes below 1, this is when the epidemic is controlled. Okay, the effective R naught here, but the sort of the structural parameter here is 2.28. Okay, so what about chi? So as Ernesto said, and he's totally right, the value of life is a very important parameter because that's going to determine, you know, how much the planner, the government, the economy is willing to clamp down the disease. And we take some estimates from emerging market data from Vicusi and Masterman, which basically document this for a bunch of countries, and we take an average. And it turns out that it's not so different from values in the US. So in the value in the US, the type of numbers is like statistical value of life is like about $10 million. This is, maybe many of you know, maybe even much better than me. I mean, this is estimated from sort of this differential, compensated differential in terms of wages from being occupations that are more risky or less risky, okay? But basically, these correspond in the US of about, 207 times per capita consumption. And the type of numbers we're using is 230 times per capita consumption for emerging countries. This is from these estimates. Now, we're sort of adjusting for 20 years of loss. Okay, that's our estimate, given that sort of COVID tends to affect more sort of the elderly.
Cristina?
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. So maybe an alternative way to think about the sky would be to look at actually what happened and check how many thousands of cases or deaths you need for a developing country to actually take some sort of strict lockdown or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. So I'm sympathetic to that, and the CHI is definitely, we're gonna have, I don't think I have in the slides, but we do have some comparative statistics on that, and you're exactly right. So lower levels of CHI are going to basically have higher mortality, and sort of because of less mitigation, and the reverse also. So I think that's actually, we're thinking about, this has been an important parameter maybe to think about comparative statistics across countries, because the outcome, the different outcomes from different countries in terms of mitigation and in terms of sort of how the disease manifests itself, varies, even though, and mainly because of different mitigation policies. And that, could be a function of this CHI, could be encoded in the CHI parameter. Another set of parameters that we need to take a stand on are those controlling sort of the debt dynamics. And for these, so we're going to use one moment, which is we're going to think about a baseline economy, and this is coming from sort of an average across several emerging countries, sort of debt to output ratios prior to the epidemic of about 30%. Of course, some countries are much less and some countries are more, but this is going to be sort of our baseline economy. I'll show you different levels of debt, how different levels of debt affects the outputs. Now, many of a key component of this default module is the default costs, and sort of defaults are going to be sort of increasing and convex in the default intensity. And we take the parameters from previous work that I've done with Mateos Planas and Rio's rule, where we actually estimate this function to sort of 35 emerging countries. Okay, so we're just going to lift some parameters from that estimation. As I highlighted before, this quantitative work is with long-term debt of maturity of about 6 years, mean recovery of about 54%. Okay, and this is sort of these how much of the defaulted debt goes into arrears versus is basically gone, and sort of a risk-free rate of 1% and a discount factor that equals 2% for the domestic rate. And again, this is going to be a weekly model. Okay, so let's move on to the results, the quantitative results. So we're going to look at some baseline economy that starts with this steady state level of debt, and I'm going to show you some paths. And I'm going to first tell you a little bit how the policy rules work, and then I'm going to consider a little bit alternative scenarios in terms of different lockdowns or less debt. And finally, the counterfactual. Okay, so this is sort of some policy rules.
Cristina, there is a question.
Yeah.
Yes, Juan, you can go ahead.
Hi.
I can't hear.
Juan?
Do you guys hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. So why is it that I'm not very familiar with these default models? Why is it that you need this effect through productivity? Why isn't the effect of expected default on Q enough to generate the effects you want?
Well, so there is this so a couple of points. So qualitatively, okay, the traditional sort of Eaton Gersowitz model had the penalty of default being exclusion from financial markets. Okay, so maybe that's one thing that you're thinking in terms of Q. So if the country defaults, then the economy is excluded from financial markets. That would be enough qualitatively to basically allow for some borrowing. Okay. Turns out that in calibrated models, that it's going to generate very, very tiny debt to output ratios because the cost of, if you're using your debt to smooth consumption, the cost of those fluctuations are very small. Okay, and so that's one. And so the literature has taken on. So you need some extra cost to basically. So it's more meaning like 0.01% of GDP is the maximum that to output with that type of costs. So the literature has sort of taken on these additional costs that actually are empirically relevant. For example, if you think that the financial sector, and that's going to be that is actually one of my preferred explanations, that sort of government debt crisis affects financial intermediation domestically, and that is going to put a pressure in terms of the possibility of firms to access loans for their projects, which in turn is going to reduce output. So, so the ideal would be to have this type of endogenous model, and I have some work on that, and other people have worked on that. But it basically looks like a reduction in something that looks like productivity. So in this model that I'm sort of focusing on sort of the epidemic, I've sort of taken this shortcut of, and actually did not me, but many people have, to think about costs of default in terms of these resources, and in particular productivity.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me just say a little bit about the policy rules here. So so here we have two state variables. One are the fraction of people that are infected, say from 0 to 0.2%. So this is mu I, and the fraction of people that are susceptible, 0 to 1. Okay. So you see that lockdowns tend to be much larger, more higher when you have a lot of people infected or susceptible. This is when the epidemic is very contagious, right? So this is when it's most beneficial to lock down the economy. But what happens in our model too is that that's also going to be the states in which default is more likely. Okay, so and part of the reason is what I mentioned earlier. So when you lock down the economy, this leads to a reduction in output. These are classic cases, sort of a big recession. This is classic case when default is more likely. Second, this is when sort of the prospects for debt repayments are low, and the default is more likely. So the added thing relative to the literature that we've seen on COVID is that how contagious the disease is doesn't only affect your health policies, but also your debt policies. Lockdowns, though, are also going to respond on the level of debt. So you see here this picture. Okay, so it mainly responds actually to how contagious the epidemic is, but it also responds to debt. And the result is that when the debt is low, lockdowns are going to be a little bit more severe, because this is when the government has the fiscal space to support consumption while locking down the economy. Okay, now the time paths. So we're going to start the epidemic when an exogenous, I think it's like 0.5% of the population become exogenously infected. And what you see here, let me just tell you the dashed line first. Okay, the dashed line is an economy where there's no lockdowns. You can think of this as sort of the exogenous SIR models. So how do they work? Okay, so there's a sort of an amount of population that is hit with, that has a disease, and then the epidemic just goes through the economy. The number of infected go up to 20%, and then go down, because when you have enough infected and the number of recovered have fallen, then this is when there's no new people infected anymore. Everybody has immunity. Almost everybody has immunity, and that level of immunity is enough to basically kill off the disease. Okay, so absent any mitigation policies, the parameters that we put in imply that peak infections are 20%, and the fraction of people that are going to be infected with the disease is very high, about 88%. Okay, in our model, of course, we have this possibility of mitigating the disease with lockdowns, and that is going to reduce the number of infections from about 20% to about 8%. So it really flattens that curve. Okay, but also actually changes the final. So you don't only flatten the curve but actually you change the outcome. So instead of 88% of people getting the epidemic, you only have 70%, still quite high, but sort of lower than before. Now, in terms of the mortality, so absent any mitigation policies, sort of this disease predicts, given our parameters, it's going to predict that about 1% of the population will die from the disease. And with the mitigation, that is going to reduce quite a bit. It's going to reduce to, be able to reduce it by half. Now, how does this optimal mitigation policy looks? So these are the properties, okay? And basically, these properties are not so different. A little bit, they're going to vary a little bit with debt, okay? But they're mainly affected by the epidemiological parameters. So first of all, lockdowns start a little bit, not at the outbreak, okay, but 2 months in, okay? And then it's going to last for 8 months, but it's going to have 3.5 months of high intensity of about 40%, but then it's relaxed. And after about 40 weeks, basically the lockdowns are going to be zero, and the economy, the mitigation, the epidemic is going to be over. Okay, so that's the epidemiological groups. Now let's look at what happens with the sort of economic variables. So first, let me talk about output. So output is basically a reflection of the lockdown policy, okay? To first order. Then consumption, of course, doesn't really mirror output here because you have debt. And so consumption is sort of reduces on impact, okay? And it's still quite intense. So you have a sort of declining consumption of on impact 30%, then 20%, right? And the decline of 2, 3, 4%, I think is this number here, is going to last for a long time. On the right hand, you see default. So there's these sort of paths of default. So initially you have sort of a period of high default intensity that coincides with lockdowns of about 50%, but then the default intensity falls, but it continues to be elevated and it's prolonged. And the reason is because of these debt dynamics brings persistence that lasts well beyond the epidemic is resolved. So here is all the paths, sort of all of them already together. Let me just focus on the partial default. So, the epidemic is basically over after 50 weeks or so, and the partial default continues to linger. And the reason is because the debt during this crisis, the extra loans plus the arrears does make the debt balloon and go beyond sort of this sort of sustainable level. Eventually, let me put this, eventually the economy sort of after 3.5 years are going to stop default and you go back to some sort of steady state. So eventually you will go back to normal, but it's just going to last much longer than the epidemic. So the COVID-19 in this environment is going to generate through the health crisis, the economic crisis, but also the debt crisis.
Sorry, I have a question. I'm a little bit confused with one thing. So if there's no lockdown, then there is no default?
So in our environment, there's not going to be default, no. I think that with our parameters. Now, there are some alternative parameter situations that will generate default, but of course, the issue without any mitigation is that the number of fatalities will just skyrocket.
Yeah,
now,
sure. But I was thinking that if you have like 20%, because without lockdown, you can have 20% of the population that is infected at a certain point in time, right?
Yes.
And if you think that those people are not working, that's also like a big shock.
You are totally right. And I'm gonna, that's a very good point. Okay. So we do not have that actually. What we have is that the infected, we did not have a different, so everybody's working except the diseased in our model.
Okay.
But I agree with you completely that if you have, and this is maybe a very good point, if it makes sense that the population that is infected, especially the population that know that they're infected, they might be, the productivity might be lower, they might be in the hospital, whatever, so that's definitely going to reduce the productivity. We do not have that. That's a great question, actually, and a great point that we should consider right now, because everybody is working and equally productive. The only economic cost, which can be substantial, is that 1% of the people no longer work. Okay, and that's but that's not big enough to generate defaults. But you're right that if you have something different. Let me just say quickly, so this is optimal. What would happen if I just do an exogenous lockdown? Like I just make up this experiment, 50% starts 1 month after the outbreak, 50% for 4 months, and then, open completely. And, what happens is that you still do better than nothing in terms of the health crisis, but you do much worse, okay? And actually you make the debt crisis worse. So it's sort of like a bad deal here. I do have to say that, the way we think about these lockdowns, we don't really have a point whether these lockdowns are, imposed by the government or are self-imposed. I mean, I would think that something like this red is very unlikely to happen, because even if things are open, some people might choose to work from home, or might choose to retire, or might choose to, not, if the disease continues to be very contagious, there will be some self-mitigation. Okay, so this is but basically the point that we wanted to make with this is that sort of the timing of the lockdowns can matter for the health crisis and the debt crisis. The second point, and this is probably more important in the sense of sort of our contribution here, is that the debt, how much debt the economy has, is also going to matter for the epidemic. So you see here, sort of the baseline is going to have 30% of debt. And so what would happen, for example, as an example here, if the economy starts with no debt? Okay, so it has it still has default risk, so it has limited fiscal capacity, but it has room, okay, when it starts the epidemic. And what happens is that, the debt crisis is basically prevented, the consumption can be supported, and the lockdowns are going to be a little bit more persistent, which in turn is going to reduce the fatalities. Okay, so sort of starting with less debt is actually a good thing for the ability of these economies to be able to manage the epidemic. So, I'm going to show you I'm going to show you some tables like these. And so that this blue line here is going to summarize the plots that I showed you for the baseline economy. So just let me tell you how these plots, to read these plots. So here we have that this baseline economy generates, and the outcome is like 0.5% of the population diseased, a lockdown that lasts about 8 months, a default intensity that lasts about 43 months, so 3.5 years. And here I'm going to show you also welfare. So how costly is it, this epidemic? So in terms of consumption equivalence, okay, I told you this is about a flow of about 1.8% of consumption. If you bring that forward, bring that, in present value, that is about 87% of output, okay? So you should think of like 87% of output is the cost in present value of this epidemic. Lenders, also suffer a cost because, they didn't expect the defaults. But in terms of magnitudes, they have a very small cost, so 1.2% of output in comparison with the cost of the epidemic for the economy.
Cristina?
Yeah.
There is another question by Juan. Juan, you can speak now.
Thank you. So this idea that fiscal space allows governments to implement lockdowns is very intuitive, but didn't the opposite happen? So here in Latin America, when the virus hit the region, Argentina and Ecuador, these countries imposed severe and strict lockdowns early on, whereas Chile, for example, that has more fiscal space, did not, right? Chile came late to implementing lockdowns.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in the case of Ecuador, one thing that happens is that, of course, the timing of the when they had the outbreak was much earlier, and the mortality rate for Ecuador, actually Ecuador fits our model a bit better because they have very limited fiscal space. They implemented lockdowns. People were not really following those lockdowns. Then they implemented fines to get the lockdowns. The end of the story was that, at least in the coast, there was just like a very, very deadly disease and many fatalities. And the excess fatalities, we don't really have data on that, but some estimates are, the order of magnitude of like 15 times. So I think actually Ecuador does fit a bit our story. Argentina is sort of frankly does not, in a sense that they have implemented very, very strict lockdowns despite the fact that they have very limited fiscal space. So you could think of course, you could think that there could be many other differences. So for example, the ability to, we don't have it in the model, the ability to work from home might be sort of, larger or better in countries like Argentina than in other countries. So lockdowns might be a little bit less costly in Argentina than in some of the countries in Central America, for example. But sort of those, yeah, I agree with you that this is sort of one thing that we're going to show, and this is maybe helpful for my next slide. The only difference that we're going to think about these is sort of in the context of our control model is we're going to do one experiment here with different initial levels of debt, okay? And you should think of sort of countries that have less fiscal space to have higher level of debt and low fiscal space with lower levels of debt. But when you're thinking about an application and we're thinking about these, there could be different parameters, if you will, or different things that we're not controlling. I mean, if you think about for example, China, and I know China is very different, but if you think about China, I think that also fits our story in a sense that it's a country that has a lot of reserves and they don't have very much debt, and they implemented these lockdowns that are very draconian that were able to basically eliminate the disease very quickly, and sort of the fiscal space that they had and the lack of susceptibility to debt crises, potentially played an important role for that country. So it's true, it's sort of you could think that it's and we should, and that's part of our to-do thing, to really take it more to think about different groups of countries, but I think that there are going to be some countries that we're going to have sort of just a bit of a harder time to fit the model to, but we're still sort of, we think that they're good candidates and it still could be helpful for a bunch of the thought in terms of how different countries are managing this disease.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's think about these levels of debt. So if you think about So this was the same. Let me focus on the bottom first. Let me focus on the top. Okay. So if you start with zero debt, you have basically less lower fatalities than the economy starts with more debt. It also has sort of slightly longer lockdowns. So here we have 9 months as opposed to 8 months in the baseline. And it has less, no defaults, not so many defaults. If the economy starts with a lot of debt, they're going to have extremely long, 13 years of debt crisis. Okay. So less debt, you have longer lockdowns, more lives saved, and limited debt crisis. And more debt is basically longer and more intense defaults. In terms of welfare, you see here that the welfare from the epidemic is basically actually non-monotonic, in a sense that sort of the biggest welfare costs from the epidemic are these intermediate levels of debt. But overall, there's lower welfare losses when the country starts with low debt. Okay, yes.
Quick question, more broadly about the very first row. In the model, this has come from my own naivete on this issue, on this topic. So in the model, what makes a 40% to be high or low? I guess it has to do with the sustainability of the debt, right?
Yes. So the way that, yes, good. So the way to think about this, and thank you for the question. So we calibrated the model so that before any epidemic, and remember, there's no shocks here, the economy had 30%. Okay. So what is 30%? 30% should be interpreted as the sustainable level of debt that the country has without basically any default risk. Okay. Now, but it's sort of like the idea, but they don't want to, but they like to borrow, right? So it's not that it's very low, that it's very far away from the space where you would have default risk. So 30% is like the level of debt that has no default risk, but close to the level where you would have default risk. Okay, that's the 30%. And what happens is that that's why this baseline has this you can see, for example, the default from the epidemic, you basically don't default much. You have less, you have 0, 10, 20. But when you have 30, the epidemic makes you jump because you were sort of close to that region of default, and the epidemic just puts you over that. Okay, so after the epidemic you were safe, but the epidemic makes you go over the board. Now 40%, you were already over the board. Okay, you were defaulting even before the epidemic, but the epidemic really just makes you explode. And the same thing with those levels of debt. So yes, so the way to think about this is sort of like how sustainable it is. So this is basically sustainable, but close to being not sustainable, and 10% is like much further away. So you have much more room before you would go into any region in which you default.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me move to the last part, which is this. So you see here, if you start with different levels of debt, you're going to have a different outcome of the epidemic. I mean, all of them are pretty bad, but basically, you can do a little bit better when you have low level of debt, and your defaults are going to just explode if you had high levels of debt. Okay, so we're going to consider debt relief. So what happens if sort of the IMF, and we've seen these programs being implemented, they give the country, okay, a loan at the outbreak of this epidemic. It's a loan actually, and we're going to think about grants as well, but let's think about a loan. And the loan is equal to 10% of the pre-epidemic output. So it's a big loan. It's structured as a perpetuity in that the government is going to have to pay, the economy will have to pay for this loan, but basically, over its lifetime. Okay, so it's a long-term bond. And the repayment is going to start 2 years after. So basically, repayment of this loan is going to be the grace period where no repayment happens, but then the economy will repay, basically after the epidemic is over. And we're going to consider alternative programs too. okay, different timing, grants, etc. Okay, let me first give you, okay, this is a good thing. So this is sort of like a magical loan. Why? Because it actually doesn't have any default risk. Think about the IMF programs. They, you know, come with some commitments, so, you know, much lower default rates from IMF loans. So this is what this program does. This is going to be imposed that the country cannot default on this debt. And you see here that these loans, okay, have welfare gains, you know, produce, they're good for the country. So for countries that have 10, 20, 30% of initial debt, this loan generates, you know, about 3%, 2.8% of welfare gains in terms of output. Okay, just because it allows sort of front-loading consumption, and the government actually likes to front-load consumption. And you do it with basically commitment, okay? Now, for economies that are actually, that have debt, that have these debt crises already, this is like the levels of debt that are above the sustainable one, these loans generate much larger gains. And the reason is because you avoid, sort of, you reduce the debt reduction in the length of the debt crisis from about, you know, by about 7 to 8 months here. Okay, so the level of the gains are on the orders of magnitude of 8 or 9%. Now, what happened? So this is absent the epidemic. So the thing has some gains. This happened. Now, with the epidemic, the first row here, if you compare, okay, this says that the gains from the epidemic are with the epidemic from these financial assistance loans are larger, okay, than without. They have high gains. So think about the baseline here. This is the number that I said in the beginning. This is about 9.4% of gains in terms of business counted value of output. Okay, and why are these gains much larger, especially when you have low levels of debt? Well, because you use these gains to basically these loans to basically implement more mitigation policies that prevent deaths. Okay, so this is sort of going back to this idea of that overhang for investment. So when you have these loans, basically you can get away from the underinvestment, and you can actually invest in lives more efficiently. And the gains from when the country has high levels of debt, those gains are coming from reduction in debt crisis. So now, if you think about the gains again from this program, okay, again they're going to be these non-monotonic. They're high, okay. So they're good for all economies because they can actually, basically all these economies have fiscal constraints. Even if you don't really have default, you're still having, you know, constraints in terms of fiscal capacity. So these loans are going to be useful. But on the margin, you know, the most useful economies, the candidates for this type of loans are the economies on the margin. The economies that by giving them the loan, they can actually change both the mitigation policies that they have and also reduce the debt crisis. We also do a little bit different types of loans. So the bottom line here is that, of course, you know, grants are going to be much better than loans, but actually, surprisingly, you know, the majority of the gains are coming from sort of this cash flow in the early on that allows sort of a better outcome, more than sort of from a present discounted value point of view, the budget constraint that, you know, you just have more higher wealth. Better to do longer time loans, better to do bigger loans. The timing of the loan, when does the loan, if it's the beginning of the epidemic or the middle of the epidemic, doesn't matter that much. Okay, so let me conclude, and I'll be happy to take more questions. But in conclusion, so sort of like this pandemic generates, of course, a huge challenge for emerging countries with default risk because of this limited fiscal capacity. It can generate a health and an economic crisis as well as a debt crisis. Lower debt burden, economies that started with lower debt are going to, you know, have more fiscal space to manage the epidemic better. And in this context, sort of the debt relief programs that are being implemented by, you know, many of the financial multilateral organizations, but are probably going to happen, keep coming. Okay, this is saying, you know, those programs are very beneficial because it actually prevents debt crisis, like we they usually are meant to do, but also in the context of the epidemic are going to give sort of the fiscal space to governments to better handle and manage the health crisis.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So if you want to ask a question, please tell us so in the Q&A section, and we will open the mic for you. In the meantime, you wonder whether you want to ask something or not. I'm going to ask something myself. Again, it's about, I'm wondering whether, especially if we talk about the emerging markets, how important for the results would be to model at least some of the households hand to mouth. And what I'm thinking is because the timing of the helping program that they can get, yeah, how effective that's going to be depends in part of the decision of households of how to smooth that models that they could get through time. And in our country, probably more than in developed countries, there's presumably a higher proportion of the households that really don't smooth consumption so much. So I'm wondering how much the result could change if we take that into consideration.
So, so I like that question, and we haven't done it. I think it would be interesting to do. I mean, we do speak to our model. I mean, I want to say we do speak to that because this is precisely the point here. So, so one thing that we find is that with default risk, if you think about the baseline of a developed country that doesn't have default risk, they could probably smooth consumption almost completely and then have these sort of reduction in output with changing little the consumption, okay, the aggregate consumption. What we are saying is that default risk is precisely doing a little bit like a rationale of why the economy as a whole looks hand to mouth, okay. And not really hand to mouth because, of course, they don't equal. They have the debt, but the fact that they have very limited possibility of rolling over the debt and they have all these debt crises actually makes the economy look a little bit more like hand to mouth. But I agree. So we have that way of thinking about the issue that you raised. But I agree with you that an important part of this narrative in emerging countries is the fact that you have a large informal sector, a large hand-to-mouth, section of the economy, which will make these issues, these sort of mitigation policies, even more costly. And the fact that maybe the government cannot reach these people. I mean, maybe that's going to link a little bit to the debt crisis from the epidemic, because even if you default, you can't get the people, the resources that they need. So I think it will be useful for us to do because it's an important question. But at the same time, we do have these sort of economy-wide hand-to-mouth type of force that is exactly coming because of the default risk.
Thanks. Anyone else?
So I have a quick question. Why is it, if you can provide some intuition, that countries with very low levels of debt actually use these programs to implement more lockdowns and to prevent deaths in the country? I mean, they were able to do that beforehand, right? Because they had very, very low levels of debt. Why weren't they doing it in the first place?
Yes, so that's a good point. Well, they had you see, I mean, it might depend a little bit on the calibration, but you see here that the country that had low level of debt, okay, this is the red, absent the program, okay, they did their trade-off. Okay, they say, okay, I want a smooth consumption and I want to implement more lockdowns. Okay, So they did that trade-off and they made that decision. If they would want to make as much if they would want to implement as many lockdowns as with the debt relief program, okay, then that would actually imply that the consumption would need to fall. And what this debt relief program does is that, you know, this economy, even with, you know, very little debt, it has fiscal space, but it's still limited, because you see at 30% of debt, you think at 30% of debt, you're basically at the corner already. So you can't really do like, you know, 40, 50, you don't have as much. So even the low level of debt economy benefits from larger fiscal space.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if there is no more questions, we should probably stop here.
Yeah.
We thank Cristina very much for speaking to us. This very interesting paper, and we expect to see you all next Wednesday, 11:30 p.m. Chile time. We will have Ludwig Strauss from Harvard speaking. Thank you, Cristina, once again, and stay tuned.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.